Hey, this is our Thoughtful Thursday quarantine edition, and I'm here with my friend Emmett Price. Emmett Price III. Man, I'm gonna tell a quick story about Emmett Price. When we met first time, I had a colleague of mine say, "Oh man, I met the David Bailey of Boston," and I told him that on the introduction. He says, "No, man, you must be the Emmett Price of Richmond." So, Emmett Price is a very delightful guy, man. He is professor at Gordon Conwell Seminary up in Boston. He is the executive director, right, of the Center for
That's right.
Black Church Studies, Black Church Experience. You can tell me a little bit more about that. He is also, do you still consider yourself a musician?
Absolutely.
So we got Emmett Price, man, just a pastor of the church, but also just a really wonderful guy, man. So, um, yeah, so I'm glad you're here, man. Thank you so much for taking this time. And so what we're going to do is we're going to explore the question: how do you do advocacy and bridge building in the midst of a crisis?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And we are kindred spirits. We don't know whether we're located in Boston or Richmond, and which name we're gonna go by, but we are certainly kindred
I
spirits.
know
And so
that's
I appreciate the invitation. So you're here in Massachusetts. I have the privilege of serving as the professor of worship, church, and culture at Gordon Conwell Seminary. We have 4 campuses across the nation, and 2 of them happen to be here in Massachusetts. I also serve as dean of the chapel, so
okay.
kind of the pastor of the seminary, and then executive director for the Institute for the Study of the Black Christian Experience, which aims to reunite and reconvene the narrative of Black Christianity across the diaspora.
Yes, good.
So folks are still asking the question, is Christianity the white man's religion?
Right,
And our response is it never was.
right, right,
And,
right.
and, and, and then we go in and talk that through, improve it both biblically, theologically, as well as in terms of resources. So what I'm getting at is part of the way that I have been able to step into the role of an advocate in this season is based on relationships that have been groomed and nurtured, over the last couple of decades.
Yeah, yeah.
When things happen like a cataclysmic, pandemic like COVID-19, folks go to tried and true and trusted resources, people who they have navigated and negotiated with in the past, and people who they have resonated and worked with in the past. And so I've had the great privilege of being consistent as well as being located where I am,
Yeah.
for long enough for people to know that I'm here. And so it's not so much about what I do, it's just about, where we are, where God has blessed us to be, and then also our relationships and the networks that we have.
I want to just take a moment and just kind of pause a little bit about just the challenges of like being a Black Christian
Yeah,
on this side of the Middle Passage experience, right?
yeah, yeah,
Like, I mean, and so you're right. If you really know your history, I mean, really, Christianity was more Black and brown, looking for the first 300 years. I mean, really for centuries, right? I mean,
yeah.
for multiple years, and I think it's kind of a lot of people don't really know that. They think about
Mhm.
kind of the European colonizing imperialistic side of Christianity. Well, you got Constantine, and that's
Mhm.
kind of like that Rome dynamic. But then I think oftentimes when people are talking about Christianity being a white man's religion, they're talking about the influence of Portugal, Spain, England, and the misuse of Jesus and Christianity for oppression, and
Yeah,
that's a very real
yeah.
thing.
Absolutely,
But
absolutely. The Crusades and all kind of stuff before that and after that. But what the other piece is that the iconography and the imagery of Christianity changed drastically around the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th century, when the painters and the sculptors who we know now as the greats of the greats, the Rembrandts and the Picassos and, the Gauss and, all those folks, they chose to depict Christianity in a Eurocentric haze,
yeah,
if you get what I'm saying. They
yeah,
they 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 de
Michelangelo. Yeah.
Yeah, Michelangelo
Yeah.
Sistine Chapel, and
Yeah.
the Vatican in Rome, and part of that was an offshoot of what Constantine was doing in terms of normalizing this sense of we are who we are, which goes back to Pope Gregory, and the whole notion of trying to unify the Catholic Church under one banner, but also under one ethnos,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so, in that sense, we have this kind of colorization or decolorization of Christianity, such that when people say that Jesus most likely had melanin in his skin, it's almost like we are proverbially, pointing our fingers at somebody,
Yeah.
when that actually is the truth from where he phenotypically was born and the social location of who he and his people were.
Yeah.
So we got to get back to the facts, and get back to the realization, and not get bogged down in terms of the notions of cultural imperialism within Christianity.
Yeah. And I mean, why I could hear somebody being like, "Hey, I mean, why does that matter?" Like why just we just don't stick to the gospel? Why we just don't like identities in Christ and not ethnicity? So
Yeah.
why? What would you say to somebody that says that?
Well, I think it does matter. And I think what this conversation is showing is how it matters, because biblically, you go Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 to 27, and that notion of not only the imago Dei, but the fact that when God gave Adam and Eve dominion over the earth, he gave them dominion over the flying things, the creepy crawly things, and the swimming things, but never dominion over other human beings.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's part of that narrative. And clearly the imago Dei, we were created in God's likeness and God's image. And then you look at the Song of Solomon, the woman in Song of Solomon self-identifies herself as a Black woman.
Yeah.
You look through the Bible and see the various places that the African continent not only shows up, but is really focused on, right? So we have an Egypt narrative, both sides of Exodus, as it were. Moses, Miriam, and Aaron were born in Egypt,
Yeah.
right? I'm not trying to say that they're not the Hebrew children, but they were certainly part of the diaspora of the Hebrew children, because they were born in Egypt. And then you go to the New Testament, Jesus ends up in Egypt for some reason,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Whether you want to call him a refugee or exile, whatever, you can do whatever terminology you want to. Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch,
Yep.
the reason that the eunuch is identified as Ethiopian is because that person was traveling in a chariot from Ethiopia, Africa, not Ethiopia, Italy, right? And so I think that those points show the biblical notion of the importance of place. I believe that place is where God reveals God's self, right? So places matter.
Yeah.
And so when we can't identify as being progeny or being ancestors of these different locations, then we disconnect ourselves from where God revealed God's self. And so if the only people that matter are our Europeanized reading of the Bible, then we're privileging certain places over other places, which begins to move that we're privileging some people over other people, which now is not biblical.
Yeah.
So I think it all has to do with the Bible.
Yeah. Oh man, that's so good. And I even know, for me, I had a great privilege in 2018 to spend a week studying the Christian imagination by Dr. Willie James Jennings.
Oh, brilliant brother.
Brilliant guy, man. With him, great scholar, great master teacher. I mean, he could teach his scholarly book to a group of people in the restaurant that don't know anything about Jesus. Like, I mean, like he's just so, you don't really have people that can kind of do that often, And then he was a really great pastor and a fun person to be around. But that was my first time. I feel like I had like a third conversion, man, when I was just reading that book with him. And it was one of the first times that I really understood the importance of place.
Yes.
Like, and he kind of points that like the dislocation of place and faith and the disconnection of it, the disintegration of that is actually a result of the colonial imagination.
Yes.
That really kind of, you think about this, that like, they had to say like, hey, this place doesn't matter. Like your faith matters,
Yeah.
but your location of your place doesn't matter because the land in which you're standing on, we need it for our purposes. So
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
we end up being formed in this, and so like it's and this is part of what we've inherited, is a
Yeah.
dislocation of place in a really significant way.
Yeah, I mean, this is so important because when you think about how we interpret the Bible, or even better yet, how we read the Bible, we can read the Bible, regardless of what interpretation you use, whether you're in the Old Testament, New Testament, there's some names of places that we just over,
Yeah,
right? Because
yeah,
we can't pronounce them,
yeah,
right? And we make them less important.
yeah,
And then with those places are the people who are called by the place location name.
yeah,
We over that too,
yeah,
right? And then we call people's names and we butcher their names too, right?
yeah.
Because we may not know Hebrew or we may not know, Greek.
Right.
And so the point that I'm making is that we can't normalize biblical history, biblical people, and biblical locations because of our inability to articulate what the Bible says.
That's good,
We
bro.
need to learn what the Bible says, same way that we need to learn who we are as people, right?
That's
So
good.
where do you come from? What would you like me to call you?
Yeah.
And let me get your name, right? So we have so many people from around the world who are taking on pseudo American
Yeah.
names so that we don't call them by their birth name or by their
Yeah.
traditional ancestral name. And I'm like, you know what? That's not right, because that privileges some people's social locations, and it condescends other people. So if your name is hard to pronounce, then I need to honor you and take the time to learn how to pronounce it.
Yes. Yes. That's good, man. That's a good word. Well, man, before we jump into this, 'cause I think this is another building block that's real important to understand, like, of ways to be able to be a good advocate and bridge builder in the midst of a crisis. And your you know, I think you and I sit in between a really challenging space, man. And I won't say things that, I know you're employed for Gordon Conwell, but
Mm-hmm.
you know, I don't know, I'm in and out of Boston, but generally speaking, white institutions
Mm-hmm.
like a Gordon Conwell are not that trusted within black
That's
communities.
that's correct.
And then black communities, I mean, like black people who are like in with white institutions aren't highly that trusted,
That's right.
and I think it's for good reasons on both sides. Like I'm not going to like
Yeah.
act like it's different. So I think you and we oftentimes, I think part of the struggle with being a black bridge builder in the ways that we are, it's kind of tough because there's a lot of work that you got to do on both sides to build trust.
Yeah.
A lot of times you could be in a meeting and they talking about your community over here. They talk about the Hampton Ministers Conference or whatever the case may be.
Mm-hmm.
They write them off as liberals or whatever the case may be. And
Mm-hmm.
then you kind of like, yo, you don't know these people. Like some of these folks, man, like they really know and love Jesus. Like, I mean, like more than you really do. Like, you maybe
Mm-hmm.
could, like, there's some folks that I think people I grew up with, man, that don't have no PhD, don't have
Mm-hmm.
no MDiv, but they got like a PhD in faith.
Yes.
They
Yes.
can't exegete a text, but they just
Yeah.
know a lot. And they might say some stuff that might be a little off, but then I also on the other side, I'm like, yo, y'all ain't got it all together either, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and you might need to get that plank out your eye, But then
Mm-hmm.
when you kind of on that other black side, they're like, yo, man, you with the white evangelicals, bro, I don't know what I can. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, all white evangelicals ain't bad. All of them ain't, if you're not a Trump supporter or whatever the case may be,
Mm-hmm.
or even if they did vote for Trump, don't necessarily mean they believe in all the things that,
Mm-hmm.
Trump is
Mm-hmm.
talking about. And so,
Mm-hmm.
it's you end up being this really, really tough spot. But I just want to get some of your thoughts, man. Like how do you live in that tension? I think it's also been key for you to be able to do what you
Yeah.
do, what we about to talk
Yeah.
about. But like just kind of talk about it because it's not an easy thing to do, man. I mean, you and I live in that
Yeah.
space.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely not an easy thing to do, and I think it takes an interesting um, character like you or I, because you have to be so grounded in your own skin
Yeah.
to be confident in not just who you are, but who the Lord has created you to be.
Yeah.
And I joke with people that I wake up every morning and I ask Lord, am I done? Right? Can I go back to, right? Because before I came to the seminary, I was a professor of music and African American studies at a top research
Oh
institution
wow.
in Boston, Northeast University,
Oh wow.
and my calling was actually to go to seminary while I was already a professor.
Uh,
And as a result of going to seminary as a professor, you know, I had new eyeballs on me, and I was invited to this post. So I never applied for it. I was kind of courted for it, but the Lord did that. And so I'm always saying, Lord, you know, can I go back? Can I
yeah.
go back? You know, it's
Yeah.
just like COVID-19, right? You know, are we done yet? Can we go back?
That's right.
Right. And you know, the Lord is faithful, as well as the Lord is always forward motion,
Yeah.
forward, right? So the Lord is showing you things that you may even feel insecure about,
Yeah.
but God is challenging you to walk in that space. And so that's how I'm reminded that I am who I am, regardless of what side of the street I'm on, regardless of what room I'm on, you know, whether I'm in the boardroom or the billiard room, you
Yeah.
know, whether I'm in the C suite, right, or the back suite,
Yeah.
you know, I'm the same person with the same integrity, with the
Yeah.
same core values, beliefs, and virtues, and with the same faith.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so our ability to interpret what the left hand says to the right
Yeah.
hand is part of where the gifting is, and where the blessing is, because we can see, you know, the duality of life. We can
Yeah.
see the two Americas,
Yeah.
and we've been invited, you know, into the two various neighborhoods, right? So
Yeah.
we know the spaces, not only that Ahmaud Arbery, you know, came from, but we also know the space where he was jogging when he was murdered.
Mm.
You know what I mean? We know the spaces, and we've been to those places, and we understand how to interpret that from a position of love,
Yeah.
from a position of the gospel, but also from the position of the self-realization that we are who we are.
Yeah.
And so we allow ourselves to be vulnerable and transparent when the hurt is real, when the pain is real,
Amen.
and the frustration is real,
Yeah.
and we can articulate that on both sides of the street.
Man, that's so good, brother. That is so good, man. And I want to encourage a lot. I mean, I really think that that's part of the call to be a Christian, right? I don't think you and I are doing
Yes.
anything doing special. I think when you look at Philippians 2, that God,
Hmm.
being God, decided to humble himself, to take on the
Yeah.
form of his own creation,
Yeah.
and didn't come as a know-it-all. Like, he
Yeah.
learned the particular cultural context of Jewish culture. Like, he
Yeah.
went under circumcision. He sat under rabbis when, he literally created the world and wrote the book.
Yeah.
But he went and learned a particular cultural context and worked within the confines of that cultural context to bring the kingdom and empower other folks and to be at the margins and all of that type of activity. And I think that's the call of Christians. I think that, like,
Yeah.
because of your gifts and my gifts and the unique call that God's called us to, we kind of stumbled across that, I think, in ways
Hmm.
that's
Hmm.
a little bit more I guess particular, but I think that everybody has a version of this similar kind of call.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, I think that's part of Paul's ministry in the New Testament. You know, I'm fond of Romans. Well, I'm fond of all of Romans, because I think Romans is a phenomenal study on how Paul was challenging the Jews and the Gentiles to get it together.
Yeah,
You know, come on, Christ died for all of
yeah,
us, right? Regardless of what side of the street you're on.
yeah,
You know, Gentile in Greek means other than Jewish, right?
yeah,
So there's a huge parallel here. But in chapter 12, verse 13, he talks about rejoice in hope.
yeah.
He talks about be patient in tribulation. And then he also talks about pray constantly.
That's
And,
good.
and, and that's the trifecta. You know, for those of us who are reconcilers, bridge builders, whatever articulation we want to use, right? Rejoice in hope. If there's a mustard seed of a smidgen of a possibility that will have impact, man, you better rejoice in
I know
advance,
that's
right? You,
right. I
you
know
better
that's
hold on to that. And then be patient in tribulation. So
yeah.
while we're pressing in,
That's good, brother.
be patient, right? And then the third piece is to pray constantly,
That's good.
right?
That's
You know,
good.
be in that dialogue with God, so that we can get the audibles that God is calling in real time.
Yeah,
So I think that that's part of what the challenge that we've accepted. But then, as you mentioned, the further you go along, God graces you, man. And God is so merciful to
God's
just give us
merciful.
people to walk alongside of each other, just to encourage us, and just to have conversation like this one right here.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know, so folks who are listening should know that I'm extremely fond of the work that you do and have been doing for years. under different names. I mean, that's how many years I've been following you.
I've been involving, right? Yeah, but so many name changes. The brand. We really needed a branding ministry. That's what we needed. I forgot. That's great, man. That's good. That's so good, man. Well, so it's been good. We were on a call, working on some projects and youth engagement, and we had to basically make it audible just because of COVID.
Yeah.
And and just kind of hearing you talk about serving, you just doing what it is that you're doing, and you're particularly working on a project on like youth empowerment for churches, like youth leadership development, empowerment for churches who are out of the diaspora, right? The African
That's
diaspora.
Correct. Yeah, in Boston.
In Boston,
right.
In the Boston area.
Mm-hmm.
So, what are some of the needs like you witnessed in the midst of COVID-19, like in your community, like in this crisis? Because I think helping to see some of these needs, I think, is really important. But then also like how y'all have been able to respond has been really great too.
Yeah. So through the Institute, we've been working on a project that we call Equip, #Equip, Nurturing Strong and Courageous Youth. And we partner with 15 Afro-diasporic, including Afro-Latinx congregations.
So that'd be African American?
Yep. So we have a couple of churches that are primarily Nigerian. We have a couple of churches that are primarily Haitian, and then some, Caribbean. We had a phenomenal church that is led by a pastor who's Dominican, and then the majority of our churches are African American, domestic United States Black led, with Caribbean, African, even Caucasians in their churches, various sizes, some really large, some middle size, some really small. And one of the things that we find is that everybody is striving for connection. The connection is the number one. When you ask the leaders of the youth and family ministries, what are the one things that they're focusing on is how to connect, how to stay connected with the young people, how to stay connected with parents, even them as leaders, how to stay connected with their senior pastors and the vision for the church going forward. And then one of the things that we've been able to do is actually pick up on the quiet need, which is encouragement. And so we've been able to come around them and just encourage them, just stay in touch, sending texts to some of the leaders and say, hey, we're thinking about you, gathering them. We were gathering on a monthly basis for our project. Now we gather every other week, right? To create more frequency so we can talk through certain things. We've created a group chat, so that we can pose questions and get people to interact and engage with one another, because that connection piece is so important. Because what happens is people with information are empowered to make different choices and different decisions. People without information have no idea what's going on. Right. So when you have things like the CARE Act and you have things like the, payroll protection, plan, those folks who know about it, particularly in advance, can leverage their resources or ask for help so they can be prepared to put together a proposal or a plan, right? So in order to receive that type of funding, you have to have connection with a lender. Many of our churches don't have connections with a lender, right? And then in order to apply, you have to have some kind of sense of accounting so that you can work through how much money you need, how much money you're short, when can you pay it back. So if you don't have, and again, many of our Black churches have a treasurer, but they don't have an accountant. Right. So we watch some of our Caucasian brothers and sisters who had already heard that this was coming down the pipe, had already had appointments with their bankers before we even went into quarantine, had already, navigated so that when the drop date happened, they were already in line to put their thing, so all the money ran out in the first go around. And many Black churches, particularly middle-sized churches, which are, 75 to 125 people in the congregation, to smaller churches, they blinked and it was like, what happened? You mean there was help? Where was it? How come we didn't get it? Right. And then the second round comes around. And again, you can't find lenders who are willing to work with you because of historical,
Yeah.
oppressive systems that are systemic in our neighborhoods,
Yeah.
right? So,
I mean,
we
I mean, it
mhm.
just to pause for a quick minute. I was speaking at this Praxis Academy, and man, there was this really sharp, I think she was African young lady who was felt a call at her mission to really help with like black banking.
Yeah,
And this was something she said that was so profound to me. She says the center of uh, of the black community historically has been the church. The
yeah,
center of white community has been the bank.
that's right,
And I
that's
was
right,
like, I never thought about that before,
that's
right?
right, that's right.
It's so fascinating, right? And so part of what she was saying was like, we got all this faith, but we don't know how to deal with finances, right? Like,
Mhm.
and I'm not talking about like people don't know how to man a budget and spend less than what I'm talking about like this whole, I mean, it's a whole different world. I don't know how you grew up, but
Mhm.
man, in the church that I grew up, man, I mean, there might have been one or two people with a master's degree,
Mhm.
but it wasn't like a highly. The only lawyer that we had was the pastor's son was a lawyer. He became, at least about my sister's age, he became a lawyer, and he worked for the state. So you just not like the things that are like common knowledge in a lot of the like kind of white spaces that we're in
Mhm.
are not that common in our community. So then oftentimes people are like, well, why they know? I mean, everybody knew that this. No, everybody didn't know because the type of quote unquote common knowledge isn't the same deal. And then the last thing, particularly around the banking aspect of it, the black banks, like if there was a black bank that was prosperous, a lot of times it got destroyed. You know,
Yeah,
whether it's like in Oklahoma, whether it was in
yeah,
Durham, North Carolina, even
yeah.
Maggie Walker, one of the first black
Yeah,
women
Black millionaires. Mhm.
millionaires, right, about a mile or two away from my house.
Mhm.
That bank doesn't exist anymore because when these banks were doing well,
Yeah.
they literally got burned down or destroyed, or even that movie. I highly recommend people to watch that movie, The Banker. I don't know if you've seen it yet.
Yeah,
It was
yeah,
really good, but there's a long history in this aspect of it,
yeah,
and so there isn't like a lot of institutional memory
yeah.
within African American and or African or Caribbean Black diaspora churches and community.
Yeah, but you make a number of great points because I would, as you mentioned, the banker, I would encourage folks to watch the Netflix special on Madam C.J.
Oh
Walker,
yeah, so good,
right?
so good.
Because a sister who comes out of Indianapolis
Yeah,
and has this national platform, and it disproves the predominant narrative that all Black people are poor
yes,
and that we don't have successful Black people who are entrepreneurs and who
yeah,
are, in her case, a millionaire,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And so the point that we go to is when we operate from a common knowledge sense and don't have access to not only the information or the opportunity to even practice the information, then we're already at a deficit. So one of the things that is important is people watching this or listening to this need to understand that there are some systemic disadvantages
yeah,
that should you desire to be helpful, should you desire to be an advocate, should you desire to be an ambassador of righteousness and justice and holiness, and however you want to articulate that in some good
yeah,
Christianese,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Then you need to acknowledge the systemic challenges and not just say, oh, that was then,
yeah,
why are we worried about that,
right,
and I think our ability to acknowledge that leverages a playing field so that we can work together with consensus to build so that we don't have to deal with the Black Wall Streets,
yeah,
as you mentioned in Oklahoma, so that we don't have to deal with the redlining,
yeah,
right? So Black folks not even able to get mortgages in certain neighborhoods because certain folks, not all white people, but certain folks didn't want Black people to live in their neighborhood, right?
yeah,
So that we don't have to deal with this kind of re-entrenchment of segregation going back to Reconstruction time and Jim and Jane Crow laws, right? So
yeah,
I think the challenge is that there are too many of us who are becoming immune to history
yeah,
and having purposeful naivete
yeah,
um, that we don't realize that Black and brown people historically, systemically, and really on purpose
Yeah.
are at a deficit.
Yeah.
And so it comes out in COVID-19,
Yes.
where you have, a huge disparity in terms of who is living through the pandemic and who is dying.
Yes.
And you can look at certain areas around the nation that have short populations of Black and brown people, but when you look at the percentages of death to the disease, the disparity is wide open,
Wow,
right? That's
bro.
because of systemic things that are happening. I heard the story of a sister, a Black woman who called 911. I forget exactly where she was, but she called 911 because she thought she was having symptoms and she wanted to get a ride to the ER to get some medical care. And the EMTs told her that she didn't look LOOK. She didn't look like she was sick, and that she should call them back when she was blue in the face.
What?
Now, most Black people don't get blue in the face,
Right. Right.
right? So the very notion that the EMT had the power to essentially disrupt somebody's care and refuse care to someone, right? I mean, this is systemic. I'm not trying to say it's racism. I'm saying that there was a decision
Yeah.
that this EMT made,
Yeah.
and perhaps there were a number of different things that they used to make the decision, but unfortunately, qualitative and quantitative data show that Black folks are continuously at higher risk and are dying more frequently than anybody else.
I think one of the things that the listeners, particularly, I just think too much given, much more is required.
Yes,
And I
absolutely.
think that's a little bit of particularly Gordon Conwell has a reform bias, right? Like,
Mhm.
and I can't remember who was it, but it was I think a friend of mine. I think Corey Whitmer. I got this from. He was talking about the theology of predestination,
Mhm.
and there is a way that you can do predestination where you could see yourself as like a city on a hill, and you
Mhm.
can interpret predestination as a place of privilege about
Mhm.
who's in and who's out, and like
Mhm.
like like
Mhm.
if God just chose me and I am in a blessed situation and some people aren't, and I just don't know what to say.
Mhm.
Or you could do a predestination where like God chose you, but it leads you towards responsibility. And that's
Mhm.
kind of the type of predestination that Black Moses did, also known as Harriet Tubman,
Harry Tubman, that's
where
right.
she kind of saw that, like, I don't know why I was the one that got free. I don't know why I had the will to fight, but
Mhm.
God didn't call me to do this so I could be in a place of privilege
Mhm.
and just maintain that and just have this good life. But I need to have a responsibility to deliver as many people as possible.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of a type of predestination. Like if basically if God called and chose me and I got to be more responsible and kind of be implicated to kind of help folks out and to try to empower people to go to that next level. I think that's kind of predestination that
Mhm.
we want to engage in, and I think that's the kind of predestination I see, with you, like in the work that you've been doing about like trying to kind of do some advocacy and some bridge building, as a professor, but then also as a Black man, as
Yeah.
a Black pastor that's still connected with the Black church. Like
Yeah.
you're not a guest at the Black church. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah.
you were part of the Black church. And so
Yeah.
so can you just share a little bit how you've been kind of engaging advocacy and bridge building? And I didn't ask you to brag on yourself, but I just want you to kind of help kind of educate, teach us through your testimony. Just share some testimony about what
Yeah.
it is that you're doing. I know you're a humble brother. You don't like talking about a whole lot of stuff,
Yeah.
but man, just testify us for at least, man.
Well, I mean, part of the challenge is this: when you come from folks who didn't have much but did a whole lot,
Yeah,
you have a huge model ahead of you,
yeah,
and so, you know, my paternal grandmother had an eighth grade education, man, but she's one of the most brilliant, one of the most
yes,
faithful, one of the most phenomenal women I know on the planet.
yeah,
Who raised four children, who raised us grandchildren, and was a domestic at Hughes Aircraft, in Los Angeles,
Wow.
and worked the night shift,
Yep.
and still took care of us during the day, took care of us during the summers.
I don't know how they
And
did
so
that, man. Like,
I don't either,
yeah,
to be
yeah,
honest with you.
yeah,
But when you have that as a model,
yeah,
then I can't ever use education as an excuse. I can't use energy or time as an excuse. I
right,
certainly can't use digital apparatus as an excuse, because she
right,
didn't have any of that.
right,
So the desire to live up to the standard that my mama, as we called her, lived, creates this sense of both what you said, to whom much is given, much is required.
yeah,
But it goes back to the Bible with Jesus, when the Pharisee, when the seminarian tried to trip Jesus up and said, which is the greatest commandment, right? Thinking about an intellectual challenge.
yeah,
Jesus said, love your God with your whole heart, your mind, your being, love yourself. I interpolate this a little bit, and love your neighbor as yourself.
yeah,
And so the point to me, that's what Mama was doing. That's what Harriet Tubman was doing. And so for me, I don't ever have to ask who my neighbor is. My neighbor is whoever's in close proximity, who's in need, and has addressed that need in the same way that Acts 2:42-47 does, when they were taking the teaching and breaking the bread and praying and spending time with one another, and whoever was in need, people were selling their possessions.
yes,
So for me, as a pastor, it's always about connectivity, making sure that the folks who God has blessed us to be sheep in the house are taken care of, and know that they're cared for, know that they're loved, by even telling them that I love them, that we love them, right? And building trust over time. As a professor, for my students to know that yes, there is a power dynamic here, but the power dynamic is in your favor because you came here to study with me.
yes,
Right.
yes,
So I have a responsibility to
yes,
give you what you came here to get. Right. Which
yeah,
means that we need to have access, we need to have proximity, and we need to be able to have a conversation so that I can make sure that the omnivores are getting fed, the carnivores are getting fed, the vegetarians are getting fed, and the vegans are getting fed, right? Because the power base is on you. I need to make sure that I'm giving you what I have, right? And just in terms of being a community activist, right, keeping the ear to the ground and making sure the cell phone is always powered up, right? Because the calls and the text messages are coming in, and sometimes the most important thing that I could ever do is make a connection between somebody in need and somebody with resources. And so for me, just to have the information, right? So when we have the faith leaders calls with the mayor's office, when we are invited to the governor's, state house to have conversations, when certain leading figures in the city, want to help moderate or facilitate a conversation, and they invite you to the table, you got to show up, you got to go, right? You got to be there. And then also, when the brothers and sisters in the streets, need someone to talk to, right? When sister whomever is down the street and can't take care of her babies, and when brother such and such just got locked out of the crib, and we can't keep him out on the streets, right? We need to be able to network so that they can have access to whatever resources they need, right? So that means folks,
And weren't y'all doing something? I think it was you that, like, even you kind of helped coordinate some churches on domestic violence, because domestic violence went up, right?
Absolutely.
And then you started to kind of do some, like, help churches use their church buildings to do sheltering or something like that.
Yeah. So part of that connection of the mayor's office here in Boston is having almost weekly phone calls to try to aggregate resources so that we can be in alignment with the mayor's vision for how he wants to run the city and how to keep the city safe, but also that we can advocate on behalf of the least of these, which are often the homeless, which are often, and homeless, including homeless students, right, in the public schools, right? But then also people who are suffering from domestic violence is probably a second category. And how do we get them resources so they can get out of the house, even for a little bit, just to charge their phones up or get a little rest, right? So some of the church buildings that we're not able to use for worship centers right now, if they are sanitized and if they are properly managed, then they can be safe spaces and safe houses, as it were, for temporary. And then the third category is people dealing with sobriety issues, right? Because they can't go to their weekly or twice a week meetings, and not everybody has access to Zoom or Microsoft team meetings or whatever. So how do we create spaces so that you can get folks to be able to sit in a room together, 6 feet apart, of course, with masks and gloves on, so that they can get that help that they need.
Yeah.
So we play a phenomenally important role in bridging the needy
Yes.
and those who have resources.
And one thing that I found is that, man, I just read this with David Brenner. He talked about no matter what kind of love your parents gave you, it was insufficient, because it's always going to be some level of like just humanness that's going to be lacking, and we all have some type of poverty. It might not be material, it might not be educational, it might, for some it might not be economic, and for others it might not be relational. But like we all have some type of poverty, and I think that I've kind of found, because like you go out of like extreme wealthy spaces and extreme poor spaces, and oftentimes this more often than I can count, that in the extreme economically wealthy places, there's extreme poverty relationally.
Yeah.
There's a lot of poverty in these, like relational poverty in these gated communities.
Yeah.
And then in the extreme poor places, I find to be some of the richest places relationally.
Yeah.
And really, I'm like, when I'm over here, I'm like, yo, y'all need these people over here, and these people need what you need over there. And where else are you supposed to bring that together except for through the church of the people of God?
That's right.
Like, I mean, that's just so core.
That's
to
right.
the mission of who we are, and everybody wins in the process. Like everybody wins, and it's so rewarding because there's no end to spending where you're gonna fulfill all your the needs of your soul through spending. It just you can't spend enough. So that's the reason why you got to do something that requires you to kind of give and to be connected with the needs in the world, and to really bring full meaning to your life.
Yeah, I mean, one of the greatest principles of Christianity to me is stewardship, right? And unfortunately, too many churches teach stewardship with just one T, which is treasure, right? But I think the first T,
that treasure.
You know what I mean?
Right.
Especially now,
Right.
I think the first and the most important T, if I can give you 5 T's, the first is time, the ministry of presence, right? To be with people and to avail time. It takes time to network. It takes time to connect. It takes time to build bridges. And so being good stewards of our time, which God has blessed us with, and to use it on behalf of one another is phenomenal. I think the second T is talent. So all of us have talent, right? We have different things that God has blessed us with, whether we have learned how to operationalize it or not. That's part of the challenge of life, right? What are the things that you're good at or blessed to be able to do, and how do you learn to be even better at it? And so if we can leverage those talents on behalf of each other, that'd be a phenomenal blessing, right? The third is temple. Your physical body, which we're trying to keep safe, right? To leverage my physical body on behalf of you, right? So sometimes I need to shield you. Sometimes I need to offer you my shoulder to cry on. Sometimes I need to wrap my body around you to let you know that you're not by yourself. And the fourth one that I would suggest is trust, right? So God entrusts in us, a whole bunch of stuff, and will we trust each other with it, right? So I love when the prayer warriors come around me and they'll say, brother, I was praying for you yesterday and God placed on my heart, then they stop and they try to figure out if I'm one of those cats who will allow them to place that revelation on me and give me that prophecy. And I'm like, look, I trust you. Let me know what the Lord said.
I know that's right.
So that trust piece, right? And then I think the fifth thing is treasure.
Wow.
Because if you have somebody who has availed time to you, who has availed, trust, their talent, to you, and has availed their temple to you, and has availed, their trust to you, you don't even worry about treasure, right? That's the person who loves you enough to say, you know what, let me come take you to lunch right now because you look like we need to sit down and talk, and they buy lunch for you. They've availed their treasure, right?
Man, that's good, man. I wrote that down, bro. I'm still in the front of you. I'm gonna reference you, but
take it
at
all.
least the first 2 times. But
take it all, man. That's gospel, right? The 5 T's of stewardship. Take it all.
Good, man. That's good, bro. That's good. Well, man, it's been such a great conversation. And like, we always end our questions with, for us at Arrabon, we're always trying to figure out like what does it look like for us to be a foretaste of the kingdom of God. And the
Yeah.
way we look at that foretaste of the kingdom of God is by what's it like for us to be a reconciling community.
Yeah.
It's always a moving target. There's always different circumstances, and we need to be asking this question, like, what do we need to be a reconciling community? So, what can the church do in this type of situation that we discussed? And just give us some parting thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you for the question, because I think the church has a lot of things to do. First, we need to remember that the church is the people, not the building,
Yeah,
right? So some of us need to relinquish the hold on the building, even temporarily,
yeah,
to think about the people.
yeah,
And when you start to think about the people, then it opens up your panoramic view to think about what other people are you forgetting to think about
yeah,
while you're just thinking about these people right here,
yeah,
right? And then it forces you to really think about your mission and your vision as a congregation.
yeah,
Like, why do you believe that God called you to gather?
yeah,
And is that just an insular internal thing? Or is it to be an outreaching arm of the gospel, to go ye therefore and make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit,
yeah,
and teaching them as Jesus taught us? That's the second
yes,
part that we forget about discipleship,
yes,
to teach them about the disciplines of what it means to be a believer,
yes,
right? And so I think that that's the responsibility of the church, because when we go back to the Bible, Jesus was always building bridges. Jesus spoke to people he culturally was not supposed to speak to. He was healing people who culturally he was not supposed to be healing.
mm-hmm.
And he was hanging out with folks who he culturally was not supposed to be hanging
Yeah,
out with.
yeah,
And yet Jesus did it to the glory of God. And I think Paul tried to exemplify that with his own life
yeah,
as being a heinous, horrific, traumatic murderer and
yeah,
just blasphemer and whatnot.
yeah,
And oftentimes Paul will start his letters by saying, grace and peace to
yes,
you. I'm not worthy. I'm a slave of the gospel because the gospel set me free. And then he goes on to tell. So he tells his testimony in a vulnerable and transparent
yeah,
way.
yeah.
I think the church needs to be vulnerable and
That's
transparent.
good, brother.
Let's stop trying to hold on to everything that we've
Yes,
accumulated,
yes.
and let's reach out to people and figure out what the needs are.
That's good, man. Well, man, Emmett, man, so it's always good to be with you. And I think I told you this before, but I always was finding you in the first place because my dad's name is Emmett, man. He's
Amen.
one of the wisest men that has shaped me tremendously. I wouldn't be there because without him. And so,
Yeah.
really appreciate you, brother. Always learn in your presence. And man, could you just give us that website to your Center for Black Church
Yep.
Experience,
Black Christian Experience. Yep.
Black Christian Experience? Yeah.
ISBCE.
Okay,
Institute for the Study of Black Christian Experience, ISBCE.com.
that's good, man. And so, thank you so much, and stay tuned for the next Thoughtful Thursday. Blessings, brother.
Appreciate you, brother.
Thank you for watching the Thoughtful Thursday video. Please leave questions or comments in the comment area below. Take a moment and share this with a friend, and hit subscribe so that you can get the Thoughtful Thursday question each week.